The next part of the story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke record that they are now preparing for the Passover, although it doesn't actually say that they're preparing, except for they're asking the question, where should we prepare? It just says that it's the day of unleavened bread. Matthew has now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, except day is in italics and feast of is in italics. So it would just be now the first of the unleavened bread. The first of the unleavened bread. And the reason why they added day and feast of unleavened bread is because it's easy to understand that's probably what they're talking about, except it's not what they're talking about. This is the first day of preparation for. Like I said before, it becomes extremely obvious that this Last Supper is not Passover, the Passover Seder, the Passover meal. Passover happens after Jesus dies, because the scribes and the Pharisees, they didn't want to defile themselves so that they could still have the Passover supper, Passover Seder. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. This is not actually Passover, where Jesus says, go and prepare us the Passover. If it's the day of unleavened bread, meaning the first day of the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it means they're too late. Now, it gets very obvious later on that the Last Supper is not Passover, which means that this day I don't think is actually the Passover. And I don't know why it says when the Passover must be killed, because that can't be that day either. Because when they're going to crucify Jesus, they said we can't touch, we can't get involved, because we can't even go inside your courtroom because we don't want to be defiled, so that we can attend the feast. That's the Passover. It's the next day. Which means that it's not this day. It really confuses me how it says here, then came the day of unleavened bread when the Passover must be killed. So I'm going to leave it, but it gets real obvious later that this is not actually the Passover. It's the day before. Oh, you know what? That must be. Then came the day. Came the day, meaning it's the next day is approaching, which is at sunset. Sunset is the end of the day. In the beginning, God made the days evening and morning, right? Evening is the beginning of the next day. It's just the way God does it. So then came the day, it must be came the evening of the first day of the Passover, meaning the next day, or during the daytime, after the evening is when they would kill the Passover. So this is the Last Supper. It's the day before the killing of the Passover that they would eat the next night. So this is the night before. This is not Passover. Mark says, and the first day of unleavened bread. It just can't be the first day of unleavened bread. Here's what Michael Rood has. Event 180, this is page 221, preparations for Passover. He has in Matthew 26:17, instead of the first, the word is protos. Now at the beginning of the, and he adds in italics, preparations for unleavened bread. The beginning of the preparations for unleavened bread, because it takes a few days. It's a very involved event. In Mark, at the beginning, again, not the first, at the beginning of the, in italics, preparations for. Luke has, as the time of unleavened bread approached. Luke doesn't have those words here. Then came the day of unleavened bread. So he adds these words. I don't feel comfortable adding these words, but listen to his note. Preparations began on the 9th day of Aviv and continued through the late afternoon of the 14th. A rented upstairs apartment in Jerusalem, the upper room, was prepared for Passover and for their extended domicile through the Feast of Shavuot. This parenthetical summary details where the Last Supper would take place, not when the preparation was made. The night in which the Last Supper occurred was the last evening in which leaven could be consumed. This is also the disciples' first night in Jerusalem after spending the previous weeknights in Bethany in the Mount of Olives. So he did spend several nights in Bethany, but now this night, it's still before the Passover, the last night they can have leaven in bread because they have to get rid of it for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He has another note. The King James Version inaccurately translates the Greek text concerning, quote, the protos of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, unquote, as the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The first day of the feast is the 15th day of the month of Aviv, or Nisan, which would mean that they had already missed the Passover Seder. If it was the first day of the unleavened bread, Passover meal would have been the night before. I'm going to continue with this note. The protos, or beginning of the preparations for unleavened bread, is the situation of which Yeshua spoke. It takes several days to prepare for the Passover Seder. So, I totally agree with him. The beginning of John 13 makes this abundantly clear. Now, before the feast of Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come and that he should depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own, which were in the world, he loved them to the end. And supper being ended. This is the Last Supper. The very first verse says, before the feast of Passover, which means this supper is before Passover. Which means that Matthew, Mark, and Luke cannot be taken as simply as it says, the first day of unleavened bread. It's not. It's the first day of the preparation for unleavened bread. Now, I have an idea of how I can have it say that without actually adding words. It says after this in Mark, the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said to him, where will you that we go and prepare that you may eat the Passover? Prepare. Luke says, then came the day of unleavened bread when the Passover must be killed. He sent Peter and John saying, go and prepare us the Passover that we may eat. Right? So is it them asking the question? Or is Jesus initiating the idea? Go and prepare the Passover. And they say, where will you that we prepare? Who's initiating? Matthew and Mark misses the initial question from Jesus. It just has their response. Where will you that we prepare for you to eat the Passover? So since Jesus is initiating, go and prepare, and they respond, where will you that we prepare? And that statement is in Luke and Mark and Matthew, where will you that we prepare? It may be similar to the effect that is in the Chronological Gospels with Michael Rood, but I want to move one of these, prepare, where they're responding, where will you that we prepare? To the beginning, where it says, now the first day of, or the first day to prepare the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Then came the day to prepare the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The effect is going to be the same, where it sort of says something different from what is originally there in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But again, I've shown you, it's extremely obvious. This supper is not Passover. John says, before Passover, when supper's ended. Because Passover is the next night. This is the preparation for.
As we think about the relation between the form of the message and the meaning of the message, one of the very best places to start is with idioms and figurative language, because idioms and figurative language will lead us to some pretty obvious conclusions that then, of course, those same conclusions can be applied to other areas of language. An example of this is with the term warm-hearted. In English, we say warm-hearted when we're talking about someone who is kind and compassionate. Now, if we wanted to translate that literally into Lamogai, we can do that. If we wanted to go form to form, we could literally translate that as Antoi Nengil. The problem is, in Lamogai, warm-hearted means angry. So the translator has translated literally word for word, but has he been a faithful translator? Well, in this case, no. It's not a true statement across the board to say that literal translation or word-for-word translation is more faithful or more accurate. Sometimes perhaps it is, but it is not in every case. In this case, a literal word-for-word rendering of warm-hearted would actually corrupt the meaning. A related term is cold-hearted, which when we say that in English, we're talking about someone who is ruthless and cruel. And again, we can literally translate this into Lamogai, Antoi Nevris. Unsurprisingly, cold-hearted in Lamogai is the opposite of warm-hearted. It means he's not angry anymore. He's cooled off. He's calmed down. Now, a third related term is hard-hearted, which means stubborn and unteachable. And again, this can be literally translated into Lamogai, Antoi ne namor. But this creates a different kind of a problem. What in the world does that mean? It's meaningless in Lamogai. So in Lamogai, rather than saying his heart is hard, which means he's stubborn and unteachable, they would dig beneath the surface, and on the other side, in Lamogai, they would say Waine kauk, which literally means his ears are closed. And I can tell you that all the different ways that we use his heart is hard, and the way the Lamogai people use Waine kauk, his ears are closed, the meaning is virtually identical. Of course, to do this, that means changing to a completely different body part. So is that okay, or is that perhaps going too far as a translator? The Hebrew word barak, which literally means bless, is translated bless the vast majority of times that it occurs throughout the Old Testament, but not every time. This word occurs 5 times in the book of Job, and 4 out of the 5 times that it occurs in Job, it's actually translated curse instead of bless. When Job's world fell apart, do you know what his wife said to him? She said, "Bless God and die." Now, of course, Job knew that what she really meant was curse God and die, and the translators of all of our English versions knew that too. That's why they translated what she meant instead of translating what she actually said. Like in Job 27:7, where literally it's "he who rises up against me," another version translated it "my opponent." Or translating from my mother's womb as from infancy. Or sons of tumult, translated as riotous revelers. Made him king, translated as put him on the throne. A branch of her roots, as one of the descendants of her line. And is not crowned in 2 Timothy 2:5, translated as does not win the prize. Now, some of those dynamic equivalent renderings may concern some of you, and if they do, you may be surprised to know that the version that chose those dynamic equivalent renderings in these 6 contexts is the NASB, which has often been called the most literal. Now, I am not at all putting down the NASB. The NASB is an excellent version, but the thing that I found as I compared it with other versions in various passages, I found that the NASB and basically all the rest of the literal versions were not nearly as literal as I had previously thought. Of course, it's not only the NASB, the ESV, and every version has in many contexts chosen to use classic dynamic equivalence translation principles. Now, I realize some of you may have a problem with that. Maybe you feel like it's going too far. And I'm open to suggestions, but I refuse to translate this verse or any other verse in a way that it communicates pure nonsense.
It's a bit of a stretch, but it is accurate to what's really going on. Like with the guy who translated the Bible, the New Testament and portions of the Old Testament into that new language that had never even been written down, it's essential to translate the meaning more than the actual words if the words are going to misinform the readers. The meaning is more important than the words. I hope no one seriously objects. This is not the Passover supper, this Passover Seder. This is the Last Supper before Passover. This is what I'm going to do. Luke, then came the day to prepare. I'm going to leave off first. But I will keep day, the day. It's not the first day to prepare, because that was 6 days ago, or 5 days ago. Then came the. I won't use now. And. I'm going to go with then from Luke. Then came. The is all three. Day is in Mark and Luke, and not in Matthew, because that word is in italics. Day is Mark and Luke. 2 from Mark. Again, I want to make it real obvious that these words are not in order. I'm going according to meaning. Prepare is from Luke. Feast of unleavened bread. I don't need 4, I'll just say the Feast of unleavened bread. So the feast is in Matthew. It's not in Mark. And it's not in Luke. Matthew. The feast